Mr. Cohn, I think we're ready.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's planning and zoning work session, excuse me. And I believe, I guess the first order of business is a roll call vote. Travis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Helfrey?
Here.
Commissioner Ward?
Here.
Commissioner Broyles? Commissioner Clayton?
Here.
Commissioner Deppler? Commissioner Jackson? Chair Beatty? Vice Chair Cohn?
Here.
Councilmember Brost?
Here.
Mayor Boland? Thank you.
I guess before we're started, if there's anyone in the public that wishes to speak, please use the raise hand feature and you will be promoted to the session. Thank you. Mr. Williams, is it your turn now?
Yes, Mr. Chair, and thank you. I'm going to go ahead with your permission, Mr. Chair, and no objection from the commission members, promote our consultant, Mark Halpin of
Please do.
Davie Resource Group. And again, if there's no objection, I'll go ahead and promote Ms. Nyan, our council person from Ward 3.
Let them in.
And while that's underway, I'll give you a bit of background. As you know, when the city of Wildwood incorporated in 1995, one of its first major tasks was to try to better understand how to protect the unique environment that many of the residents of the new city of Wildwood have moved here to enjoy and certainly benefit from. The approach that was taken is to create some environmental regulations that the St. Louis County did not have in place at the time, and by those environmental regulations address some of the concerns that the incorporators and those voting for the incorporation had expressed, like mass grading of sites, removal of mature tree stands and grand trees, stormwater runoff, erosion in the creek system, etc. There were a complement of environmental regulations that were adopted. Those included the Natural Resource Protection Standards and Procedures, the Grading Code, and then tonight what we're discussing, the Tree Preservation and Restoration Code. That particular code was adopted in February 1996, so almost 7 months after the incorporation. And the rationale behind that was it required a great deal of study, input from outside experts, and then also just commentary from the public, the development community, and others. All of those environmental regulations were intended to work together, not be at opposite ends or opposing each other. So the grading code and the tree preservation code are very much interlinked in many ways, and both are intended to complement each other. And then overarching all of those is the Natural Resource Protection Standards. Saying all of that, the Tree Preservation and Restoration Code has gone under several amendments over the course of that period of time from 1996 till now. Most recently, we looked at the grand trees and how to better preserve them, and if removed, how to mitigate that removal. But we also added the Sustainable Planning's Guide many years ago. So it hasn't been forgotten, but it certainly hasn't received the level of attention that it needed. And that brought us to April of 2021, when the Planning and Zoning Commission held a public hearing. And at that public hearing, the Planning and Zoning Commission basically provided direction that it wanted the departments of Public Works and Planning to do research and see what could be better done and how better to protect one of the greatest assets of this city, its trees. In the memorandum that was provided, the department summarized some of those steps to better understand how we could do better. We started with Davie Resource Group, a gentleman named Andy Berg, who had been our consulting arborist. Mr. Berg left Davie Resource Group and was replaced by Mark Halpin, who is here tonight on screen, and we'll have some commentary later. We also talked with the Missouri Department of Conservation, the regional forester, and an urban wildlife specialist. We also had a meeting with a group of engineers and installers of septic systems because we were concerned they might be one that was doing work that we didn't have a good grasp on, and we wanted to understand better. And then finally, Ms. Keefe, who's on screen tonight as well, did the lion's share of research into different communities, approaches that those communities are taking, possible language for amendments to our code, etc. So that's what we've been doing over the last year and about 5 months. Tonight, there are 14 topics the department would like to identify to the commission. Each of those topics will be presented either by Ms. Keefe, Mr. Halpin, or the department. And the intent is just to basically say, here's what we're thinking. Is it a thumbs up or is it a thumbs down? We'll give you some background to help you in understanding that. But really, the hope is tonight to basically get your direction. And then with that direction, finish our research, draw in Mr. Halpin and any other consultants we need, and ultimately bring you back a new draft of the Tree Preservation and Restoration Code. So again, to summarize, we've divided up the 14 topics based upon expertise, and then in my case, lack of. And then we will ask those individuals, Mr. Halpin and Ms. Keefe, to kind of give a brief summary where appropriate, and then take your comments and move on. The intent is not to have a meeting that lasts 2 hours or even an hour and a half, but to try to use our time as best as possible. So with that, Mr. Chair, if there are any questions just about some of the background and process tonight, I'd be glad to answer them. If not, I'm going to turn over the topics A and B to Mr. Halpin here in a second. So if there's anything anybody would like to ask, please do so. Thank you.
I don't see anyone raising a hand or anything.
So with that, Mr. Chair, Mark, if you wouldn't mind kind of going over the first 2 topics, grand trees and stands, and then the critical root zone, and give us your opinion as our consulting arborist and an integral part of Davie Resource Group. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Hold on one second. Let me pull these notes up here. So to begin with, definition of grand trees and grand tree stands. And I have some notes on this. Andy Berg made some notes when he was working for the city as well. A few different things. One is that the one real objective part of this that does need to be retained is just the DBH minimum. However, the DBH minimum, particularly for evergreens and small trees, is, in my opinion, and it was Andy Berg's opinion too, that it's a little bit on the large side. 20-inch evergreen in our area is a very significant tree. I would recommend lowering that. I think you could go as low as 16 to 18 inches would be my recommendation. For small trees, the minimum is currently 12. I think something closer 8 to 10 would be good. But one of to me, the bigger problem with this is that there's some subjectivity as far as life expectancy. There's really no good objective way to say how long a tree is going to live. And then as far as the dead limbs and trunk with decay, one issue that has been coming up recently is that it's not really appropriate for trees in a forested setting. But even in trees in a landscape setting, it's really just indicative of whether or not that tree is being pruned regularly. Any large tree is naturally going to have a certain amount of dead wood in it that, typically in well-maintained landscapes just gets removed so we don't see it. But, if say you were to encounter a property where the resident just wasn't regularly pruning a tree in their backyard, that dead wood's not indicative of any sort of health problem or lack of vigor or anything like that. Really just using a DBH minimum and condition rating, I think fair condition or better would be probably appropriate for a grand tree. Fair is by far the most common condition you're going to find. Finding good condition trees really anywhere outside of an arboretum or botanical garden it's not super uncommon, but holding that standard for a grand tree is, in my opinion, just too much, because there are a lot of things that can demote a tree to fair condition that don't necessarily mean it's not an extremely valuable tree. I do think for both the grand tree and grand tree stand definitions, though, there needs to be a differentiation between whether or not these are in forested areas, naturally occurring trees, or whether or not they're in landscaped areas. Because again, the presence of dead wood and things like that, it's going to vary so much. Grand tree stands, again, that the definition now really just stipulates, I believe, that it's a mature, even age stand. Mixed age stands are actually more desirable. This is one we could really, I guess, no pun intended, get into the weeds on a little bit, but I think just some more objective standards for how we define a grand tree stand is going to be really beneficial. As far as critical root zone and tree protection zone, what's most commonly done in current practice is, so the current ISA best management practice is area of soil around a tree where the minimum amount of roots considered critical to the structural stability or health of the tree is located. This is often given as a formula of anywhere from 1 to 1.5 inches, 1.1 to 1.5, feet per inch of diameter. So in my opinion, just using the accepted ISA formula for that would be the best approach.
Thank you, Mark.
No
Mr.
problem.
Cohn, questions?
I have a question. So, Mr. Halpin,
I was on mute, sorry. Go ahead, Commissioner.
so you're suggesting that we go from 20 inches to 16 to 18 inches, and then for smaller trees from 12 to 8 to 10 inches. And is that recommendation based on other surrounding areas that have that as their, bellwether to go by? Or is that simply because of, what did you base your decision on?
It is partly, so there are some varying definitions out there. And that might be something we'd want to look at when you really decide on what that number is going to be. Maybe just look at what's the most common definition being used in our area, because it's going to vary dramatically. The size of an evergreen on the East Coast, for example, 20 inches is probably appropriate, but around here, it's just a little bit too large.
So it's based on our area that the recommendation was to go.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And I guess one thing I just noticed I didn't mention is standardizing. There's currently some confusion in the code about DBH versus caliper. So diameter breast height is, measured at breast height 4.5 feet above ground, whereas caliper is measured 6 inches off the ground. That's another one where there's some variation in how municipalities tackle that, but oftentimes it's something like, if the DBH is less than 10 inches, then it's measured as caliper. If the caliper exceeds 8 inches, then you move to DBH. So that's another one where it would probably be best to review a few different standards and how they're applied, just because there isn't a perfect consensus in our area about that.
Thank you.
Well,
Any other questions? No?
Well, Mark, stick around. You have a couple more later on in the program. The next item is the coordination of the grading code with other land use codes with the tree ordinance. And I was just going to kind of reiterate what I kind of said in the overview. For example, the grading code protects the building and structure setback areas from land disturbance or any type of disturbance. There is an exception for the front yard area to allow access, the driveway, and utility installations. On a typical 3-acre lot, that equated to about 30% of the area of that particular parcel of ground. What we did with the tree preservation and restoration code is acknowledge that preservation of the setback areas, and then the tree preservation and restoration code then protects the buildable area, that which is not covered by the setbacks. And that was set at about anywhere from 25 to 35%. So when you added the numbers together, the grading code and tree preservation and restoration code, the typical preservation on a lot meant somewhere between roughly 55 to 65%, allowing someone then to remove anywhere from 30 to 35%. And that usually worked out pretty well with a typical single-family dwelling, a driveway, utility installations, primarily septic system and drain field, and some of the accessory structures we normally find, like patios, decks, etc. So the department is basically supporting, retaining that kind of coordination between the grading code, tree preservation code, and natural resource protection standards. We actually think it's worked pretty well in application. And so from that perspective has been a success. As you know, and I'm moving to D now. As you know, with the watershed erosion task force that the city instituted now over 2 years ago, we spent a great deal of time looking at the condition of our watersheds, particularly the main channels of the 9 named creeks. And what we found is that we are struggling retaining some of the larger trees along those banks, particularly in Cox Creek, where erosion is causing them to be lost. And so the Watershed Erosion Task Force is looking at steps to better protect those woodland areas and individual trees along the edges of the creeks and tributaries. And they hope to have something completed in that still this year, which we can incorporate, hopefully, or at least reference in our new tree preservation and restoration code amendments. Mr. Chair, that's just a summary of those two. If there's any questions, I'd be glad to try to address them.
Thank you, Joe. Anyone?
Well, if there are no questions, Mr. Chair, Mr. Halpin has the next one as well.
Please proceed.
All right, so this is tree valuation and standards used to calculate. So currently the industry standard for this is the Guide to Plant Appraisal, 10th edition, using the trunk formula technique. That's pretty standard. And I know right off the top of my head, both Webster and Kirkwood use it because I've done some work for them recently. But that's a good industry standard, objective, accepted measure for doing that. And
I think
Yeah.
important to that, Mark, is we really don't have that right now.
correct.
And so this would be a new addition, having some type of valuation to trees as part of what I would consider ultimately a mitigation plan.
Yeah, and once those values can be, especially once you get into larger DBH trees, they can be kind of shockingly high. So it can really make developers think twice about, whether or not it's worth it for them to move around. And then it also gives you a good number to base some of your, the bond you're going to require for tree removals on.
Thank you, Mark. Are there any questions?
Apparently not.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Keefe has the next two items on your list, F and G, and I'm going to turn it over to her with your permission, sir.
Please, Ms. Keith, proceed.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you this evening. So my next section has to do with tree replacements and mitigation steps in our code. Currently, in the City of Wildwood Tree Restoration Code, we require a 1-to-1 replacement of grand trees. What we are recommending is that we study some incentives to promote preservation of our grand trees versus their removal. So not just focus on that 1-to-1 replacement, but actually perhaps even put a greater value on our trees with that protected status. And some examples of what other cities have done in the area. We have City of Clayton here. In residential developments, their landmark trees that are preserved on site are calculated at 125% of the defined canopy coverage. Oops, I apologize. Also in Georgia, in the city of Decatur, they take it one step further and grand trees are counted as 1.5 times the existing canopy. This incentivizes developers to think more about these trees when they're designing their developments and their site development plans. And then the City of Liberty has perhaps a more aggressive approach to replacement, requiring that 2 trees are replaced for every protected tree. And then they further incentivize that protection by crediting the developer against the replacement required at a rate of 2 trees per 8 inches saved. So again, we're just studying what other communities are doing to incentivize preservation of these trees.
Can I ask one quick question about that?
Yes.
So you say the canopy area. So is that measuring the current canopy of the tree versus the, growth at a certain age of the replacement tree? How is that compared?
So I believe in the City of Wildwood code, and I don't know the exact numbers without referring to it. Actually, here's my packet. Let me just pull up that section real quick. So we calculate, okay. So we actually have calculations or definitions for that canopy coverage, depending on what sort of tree it is. So for example, 1,000 square feet is required for a large shade tree or major street tree, 700 square feet for each medium tree and most conifers, and then 300 square feet for small flowering trees. So we actually maintain, define that canopy coverage. And I believe that Mark tapped on the fact that we might revisit some of those calculations as part of this study as well, to bring it up to date with current industry definitions. Does anyone have something to add from the staff?
I
Thank you.
guess my question was just about, it says 125% of the canopy coverage. Is that at, the mature tree?
Yes.
The replacement tree mature.
Yeah,
okay. All right.
correct.
Thank you.
So the next recommendation under this section is that we update our list of trees to be used for replacement plantings. Honestly, this information is constantly changing. There are a lot of databases out there, and our expert recommendations for what tree should, I guess how I would put it is, it's not always appropriate just to put any tree or replace any tree in a forest for a grand tree. Sometimes you can do more harm than good to the forest ecology by replacing a non-native tree, for example. So what we want to do is make sure that our replacement plantings are reflecting best practices of today by consulting Missouri Department of Conservation and other leading experts. The other thing we want to consider with updating this list is, are we providing all the information that we need to make things easier for people consulting this guide? Like, for example, with the canopy coverages, is that information right here in the chart? Is it clearly categorized? Can you clearly put all the puzzle pieces together to create your landscape plan? And is it, is it consumable? Is it easily digestible? So I have two examples or two guides for you to study here. One is our existing street tree list for the city of Wildwood. And then one is a fairly recently updated list from the city of Manchester, Missouri, that was actually done by Andy Berg with Davie Resource Group. And you can see that it's just a very organized, easy to consult chart. So that's what we're recommending, is that we move forward to something like that. And then also potentially incorporating language into our code to account for the fact that we do have these databases out there that are constantly updated by experts on like Missouri natives or plants or trees that might perhaps be wrong for the area. So by referring to these resources, we have kind of a living document that's constantly updating itself versus having information that can get outdated.
I got
Oh, yep.
a quick question. I mean, just
Sure.
looking out my window, a lot of my grand trees are walnut trees, but I didn't see walnut listed on any of those charts. We don't have walnut trees.
I think that's exactly why we are studying our charts and determining what is currently acceptable and native to Missouri and useful for our city environments. And I think that honestly brings another point to this, is by linking ourselves to a database, for example, or having even a longer list, we're accounting for the fact that biodiversity is good for our community. That having a wider selection available is good for our community because it makes our forests more resilient. So good point. It will be something we study as part of updating that list.
If I can make a comment on the walnut issue.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark.
That's why, so a lot of these lists will even, specify location, like street tree versus residential yard versus park and things like that. Walnuts typically, it's a fantastic Missouri native, but because of the walnuts, most places don't want it as a street tree because it is, it's a trip hazard. It can cause damage to cars. Those nuts can stain things really bad. So yeah, the more it is, I completely agree with what Robin's saying, that linking to databases is really the best thing to do, because you can kind of bury people with too much information if you try to go into too much detail on these lists.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, so next we're taking a look at what we currently do for tree inspections and enforcement of our codes for tree violations. Today, how we handle tree violations is through our typical code enforcement process. So you see that flow chart up on the screen before you. Typically, the city receives a complaint from someone who noticed some illegal disturbance. They are issued, the guilty party is issued a warning, and then our code enforcements do a follow-up to ensure that compliance was met with that warning. And if it's not, it goes to court. And that's where our city attorney deals with it. And the city of Wildwood is currently very aggressive about pursuing those violations if they keep on going. However, what we'd like to do with this effort is really work on building in the accessibility of information to the public. We don't want it to get to the point where we're taking people to court. So instead, we want to make information very easy to obtain so that there's no question in people's minds about what the city is looking for and why, and why it's beneficial to Wildwood. So that is part of this next recommendation, which is to codify mitigation steps better. Just make it clear in the code what is required if you do disturb like a grand tree, for example. What are the next steps? And we can potentially explore using diagrams, flow charts, etc., to do that. Do I have any questions, or does anybody have anything they would like to add to that?
I got a question. If there is a violation and we do end up taking the person to court, is there I don't want to call it a sentence, but a standard of what fine or penalty would be imposed?
Robin, I'll take that one
Okay.
if you'd like.
Yes, please.
Mr. Cohn, the maximum fine in our municipal court is $200 plus court costs. The key component of a municipal action in our court is obtaining compliance to the regulations. So oftentimes, in lieu of a fine, the judge will ask the individual, the property owner, basically address the code requirements for mitigation or replacement and forego, let's say, the fine if it is achieved. So we try not to necessarily have a fine. We want compliance as best as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Larry, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I guess my question is that, as a property owner, I look out at all my trees but for the benefit of the residents of Wildwood, is there any type of a list of resources where one could reach out to for an analysis or direction on their tree maintenance and selection? I'm assuming it'd be a vendor list. I mean, like where Chair Cohn mentioned, he has trees that would be good in his backyard, but not along the street. So I don't know if the city could put something together where if there's a resident that is trying to comply and do everything right, that we give them more of a reference list where they could go out and make sure they go down the right path.
Well, I think that's very much in line with our thoughts too. And maybe as I pursue, or maybe as I go into the next section, I might detail that a little further for you.
All right. Thank you.
All right. So if that's the end of questions for this category, I might move into the next.
Please.
All right. So next, we'd like to talk about the go above and beyond our code and discuss programs to assist homeowners in the many facets of maintaining and greening Wildwood. So here I want to talk about the potential for an invasive removal program or forest maintenance programs, the opportunities for tree planting and protection along the city's creeks, tributaries and other water features, and then just talking about public education in these areas and natives. So let me move in. Okay, so speaking to your point, is there any entity out there that can provide this information to homeowners? Yes, there is. And it's a very well utilized resource, which is why I think at the end of last year, they actually put a kibosh on any new people because they were running out of capacity. But our St. Louis Audubon Society provides this information as part of their Bring Conservation Home program. So they talk to landowners. They'll actually go out to their properties and consult with them and talk about what would be environmentally healthy and sustainable native plant species for their yard. They talk to them about any plant species that should be removed. They talk about water conservation for their landscape, and then other stewardship practices that promote healthy habitat. It looks like there is a wait list for it, but they are back in the swing of things. I don't see them turning people away anymore. But our understanding from the Missouri Department of Conservation is that one way to go might be providing just small mini grants to homeowners to take advantage of this program. Another opportunity, if the city is participating in this program, I think it reduces the fee for landowners that take advantage of it. But it's a really great consultation service in our area that our community could benefit from. So that might have answered at least a portion of your question. Another possible way to go, again, just on that same theme of grants, is providing perhaps a neighborhood matching grant to groups that are doing invasive removals in their neighborhoods, or other sorts of tree maintenance or care, or planting new trees, etc. What you see in front of the screen is a program done by the city of Charlotte. They award grants up to $3,000 to neighborhood organizations citywide. In this case, it's to help with tree banding and ash tree treatment expenses. But honestly, you could easily take this and apply it to any sort of program that you would be wanting to fund in terms of invasive species removal, honeysuckle, etc. Then another way to go about it would be to actually have a city-sponsored effort to make these programs happen. This would require some staff support. But like City of Kirkwood, the Department of their Parks Department is involved in several programs throughout the year, including the Honeysuckle Hackathon. They recruit volunteers every Saturday morning each month from March to November to cut down honeysuckle in one of their parks. So this is also a way to go. We could potentially have some sort of program through the city.
On the honeysuckle and possible grants, my yard, of course, was overgrown with honeysuckle, and the way I ended up removing it is I rented 40 goats. With that, I'm serious. Would something like that be possible for a grant to the residents? I mean, they do a great job.
The only reason I'm laughing is because I did watch the public hearing on this matter from last year in 2021, and I remember the goat discussion. But I'm certain that could be something that we explored to see if it would be something that would be a good way to remove honeysuckle in the city of Wildwood.
All I can say is it did a fantastic job. I got about 2 acres cleared.
Okay. Well, moving on, I would say these same program approaches could also be applied for offering programs for tree planting and protection along the city's riverways and creeks and other water features. Obviously, that type of ecological restoration work makes our community more resilient overall and is of great benefit to our city. Next, when we talk about public education about trees and soil characteristics and wildwood planting techniques, etc., I think there is an opportunity to offer a lot of materials to our residents about these topics. And again, I bring up the guide from the City of Manchester. I think the City of Wildwood, I think with our sustainable plantings guide, that originally was the intention, was that we wanted to provide some really solid information to people. Unfortunately, that guide is just, I think with it being 97 pages long and just not enough pictures, you can see actually a page from it over here. It just hasn't been as useful as we would have liked. But the City of Manchester has a very easily consumable guide. It's 37 pages long, and it tackles each of those topics and has really beautiful diagrams. Again, this was produced by Davie Resource Group, and they did a very nice job. So I think this is an opportunity to teach residents. We also have a very nice website platform. We have social media. I think this type of education is really on brand with Wildwood's identity as a city, with being an environmental leader. So I think the more that we are promoting this type of education through our many mediums, the better. But yes, this is absolutely what we're thinking.
Do you have any examples of like partnering with, high schools, middle schools to, do some of the programs for plantings, or, being part of social media to, extend this kind of communication?
I think that's a really great idea. And the city is actually in the process of cultivating a pretty strong relationship with the school district in historic preservation. But I absolutely think the same type of partnership could be facilitated here. And I've worked in such partnerships in other cities. But we haven't explored it in depth, but I can certainly add it to my notes from tonight's meeting as a direction.
Do we currently have, is this on our website somewhere, like what we have that exists now? I know it needs to be improved, but like the list of trees that you showed in comparison to Manchester, and our little list of what we were promoting, which is outdated, but is there any place that one can easily access it?
Well, I know for a fact you can access it under the updates to the tree code webpage, because I posted all 3 documents there. But honestly, I'm not 100% sure where the other documents live.
Ms.
Jeff, do you
Ward.
have an answer to that?
Ms. Ward, if you use the search bar on the website and put in landscape manual or sustainable plantings guide, it should take you directly to the link so you can find it. Again, both are a bit dated, and for the most part, we do still use them for the purposes of our code because they're referenced in there, but we can do better.
Excuse me, I have a comment. I actually, Robin, you said that our tree manual is 95 pages versus Manchester's 37 pages, right around there. Is that what you said?
Our sustainable plantings guide is 97 pages.
So while we're doing this, I went to the City of Wildwood's website, and it's been redone. It's really nice. Maybe along the bottom, the top of the page on our homepage where it has things like agendas and notify me in tourism, maybe we could get a little button there, that says something about trees or plantings for Wildwood. And then, because to go into the search bar and type in a bunch of cumbersome words, I just don't think makes it very accessible. And I'm assuming that we're having this meeting so that you can get our input. And so I would also agree with you that we need more pictures in our documents, and they need to not be so verbose. But I really think that if you're just gonna have it accessible via our website, it needs to have its own little button or own little something so that it's anybody that goes to that website can see it immediately without having to look all over. Because we do have a lot of tree policies. We have street trees, we have yard trees, we have trees in our woods. And I think that information needs to be fingertip ready, fingertip accessible, not having to, search for it. And I think that maybe at St. Louis Audubon Society, I wonder if there's a way we could put like a link to them on our website somewhere. And I guess finally, I'm sorry, I was taking notes while you were talking. And finally, one of the things is, once this is all done, we need to actually get the information out to the people of Wildwood so that they know that it's been done and it's been updated. And I don't know if that means a postcard, if that means putting it out in our mailer that we do occasionally, but to do all this work, which needs to be done truly, and then to not get it out there into every person would just be a shame. So thank you. That's it.
I have a feeling it will go in our Gazette as soon as we have some of it complete. All right, so just moving on to that final point under that same topic. One thing that we are moving forward, or we're moving towards in the environmental world, is the use of more natives in our landscaping for mitigation and protection of our sensitive lands. Natives to Wildwood are more ecologically resilient. They're better for our communities overall, and many communities around us are incentivizing and requiring a certain percentage of their landscaping plans be native. So what we are studying is what other communities around us are doing. Some of them have percentage targets. Already, we do require that our restoration plantings must contain species native to Wildwood. So I know when I've reviewed any such plan, I've always been going to the Grow Native database and making sure that the plants that go in are native species. But we can require targets in all of our landscaping plans, like other cities have done. In the city of Maryland Heights, they have a point system, so they require a certain point target. In the city of Charlotte, a minimum of 50% of new trees must be native species, and sites with more than 20 trees required will have to install multiple species. So again, that's kind of alluding to that whole species diversity concept, which I think would also be included in using more natives, is making sure that we're using a range of species. And then the city of Decatur, Georgia just makes it known that any non-native trees are not eligible for canopy credit. So again, pushing towards natives. Any thoughts there?
Any questions?
One thing you might consider including on the website is that, in full disclosure, I used to work for Forest Relief of Missouri, but they're a nonprofit. So it's not like they're making money off of this, but they do give away only Missouri native species for planting on public property. It's free. You just have to fill out an application. Public property does include HOA common grounds too. So, if you do have neighborhood associations that are maybe looking to do some honeysuckle mitigation and are interested in replanting, or if you're doing projects in parks, it's a great resource. And they also offer free education for tree planting and pruning and things like that too.
And that actually reminds me of another point that we wanted to make under this section, was that there's also an opportunity for some potential demonstration projects in Wildwood, particularly with the new Village Green project that is going to have a garden area to build in native landscaping, and then also use that as an opportunity to educate the public about natives and their value to our community. So that's a good point that you brought up, Mark, and thank you.
If there are no other questions, Mr. Chair, Mr. Halpin has the next one regarding tree stand delineation and tree preservation plans.
Mr. Halpin, please proceed.
Right. So one of the notes I have on this is this is another one where we need to differentiate between what I would call like landscape plantings versus forested settings. Currently the guidelines call for mapping all trees over 12 inches in DBH, which for a forested setting in particular is unnecessary and time consuming. For forest management, dense stands like that are never really individually inventoried like that, and it's typically just classified by forest type. If the project is going to impact directly into that forest, then you would start needing to look at the specific trees to be impacted. But having the entire thing inventoried as is currently stipulated is a little bit overkill. In the rating chart is a little bit outdated. So that should just be updated to current standards and best management practices. For the final tree preservation checklist, let's see here. Post-construction maintenance schedule might be something good to add. It's pretty vague currently as to what the developer is required to do. But including things like pruning, mulching, soil amendments, things like that. Aeration systems are mentioned a few times. That's kind of an outdated principle that could just be removed. It's not something I really see recommended or used anymore. Some of the graphics in this section can be updated too. One important thing, oh, hold on a second here. An important thing to be considered too, as far as street tree plantings, is just tree lawn width and how that relates to what's appropriate to plant there. In my opinion, in most municipalities aren't going to still continue to plant in areas that are 2 feet or less. I would recommend probably 3 feet or less. And some of the required sizes for the trees are, in my opinion, just a little too large, especially for some of those restricted areas, parking lots. A lot of the current standards in the code refer to 3-inch ball and burlap trees, which are pretty significant. There's been a lot of study done in recent years comparing larger ball and burlap trees to smaller trees, whether they be ball and burlap or containerized, really just showing that the transplant shock of those larger trees causes kind of a growth stall out. So the smaller trees will actually catch up to the larger size trees given a few years. There are definitely situations where you do need to start with a larger tree, just to avoid issues with, wildlife or, maybe even vandalism, car doors, things like that. But in my opinion, lowering those caliber requirements would really be a benefit just to tree health in general. And yeah, stipulating maintenance. Currently, I believe trees are required to survive 3 years after the initial planting. But what's unclear with the way that's spelled out is whether or not, so say someone does a planting, a certain amount of those trees die, but they continually get replaced, and 3 years later, you inspect the planting, all the trees are there. But if one of those trees has really only been there for 1 year, that's not anywhere close to being established. There's a pretty good chance that tree would just die the following year without any further maintenance. So I think just maybe spelling that out a little bit more clearly. And again, you could kind of get into the weeds on that. So I don't want to go through all of the details of the possible ways that could be done now. But I think spelling out a clear maintenance schedule would be very beneficial for that.
When we're talking about a maintenance schedule, like for a subdivision, do we need to have a requirement that the HOA associations have that as part of their bylaws? Or
whether or not the HOAs are required to maintain the trees?
yes, I mean, who's going to maintain it other than the HOA?
Well, Mark, if I could maybe make a stab at that for you.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Cohn, in a typical residential subdivision, there's multiple ownerships of the trees. There are the public trees, obviously those in the right of way or publicly held lands that may be part of the public space requirements of the city. Then there's the trees or woodlands that are part of common ground areas. And oftentimes the Planning and Zoning Commission will recommend plantings in those common ground areas to address maybe any disturbance or anticipation of screening, et cetera. And then there finally are the private trees on the individual lots. For the most part, the city will maintain the public trees. That's our responsibility. And It's our goal to make those trees as healthy as possible and retain them for as long as possible, or replace them if that doesn't work. In terms of the public, the common ground trees, once the landscape plan is approved, the obligation then falls on the HOA to basically maintain them and replace them. And we enforce that typically. And then finally, on private lots, oftentimes those are the responsibility of the homeowner. And unless it becomes a nuisance tree, we don't, as the city, get involved.
My main question was addressing the common area of the subdivision. And I would guess that the city has to sign off on all the covenants of an HOA agreement. And do you review that to see that there is some type of mechanism for the HOA to continually maintain the trees in the common ground?
Yes, that second category of trees, when the department and the city attorney review the indentures, the restrictions of the subdivision, we do require maintenance of the common ground, and they often reference any trees or improvements associated with it. So yes, we do have some stipulations that we can fall back on.
Thank you.
So, and a question, so the trees like in the front, near the sidewalk in a subdivision, those are maintained by the city, is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
And then when, say, common ground is approved, when the subdivision is being built, et cetera, who oversees whether the common ground is maintained? Is that up to the trustees of that subdivision then to report, or does the city inspect that in any way?
The city inspects the common ground before it releases the escrow and the developer completes the project. Thereafter, it's the homeowners association's responsibility.
Thanks for clearing that up, Joe, because that stuff does kind of vary from place to place, and I could not have given that in-depth of an answer. But it is another area where I think spelling out the maintenance pretty clearly is a good idea. Particularly, one thing that I just see all over the landscape is trees being over mulched with mulch applied up onto the trunk. It's one of the #1 killers of trees in our landscapes. So just making stipulations that little things like that aren't being done can go a long way, because most people just aren't aware of it being an issue. Another thing that I know it kind of gets out of the idea that those right-of-way trees, they really are the city's property and are maintained by the city. A lot of places are encouraging homeowners to water those trees when they're newly planted, because it's a tremendous cost for a municipality to take on watering those trees. And when you plant a tree and don't water it, there's actually been research on that too, and you're essentially flipping a coin on whether or not that tree survives. So that's an area where, encouraging a little bit of maintenance on the part of the homeowner, really, they are using, their own time and their own water, but it's a benefit to their own property value and to the city as a whole. So that's one area where I think going a little bit outside of that city-owned guideline is definitely recommended.
Commissioner Helfrey, did you have a question?
Well, Mr. Vunich knows street trees are kind of a hot button issue for me. And I think that they're a necessary thing. I thought it was interesting, Mr. Halpin, that you said that a lot of cities are going to not planting them in areas that are smaller than 2 feet, I think you said. I live in a neighborhood where we have some streets have wide sidewalk between the street and the sidewalk. Some streets have very little sidewalk area between the sidewalk and the street, and some streets have no sidewalk at all. And we have trees, and we have trees that people over mulch, and we have trees that are dead and missing in stumps. But one of the things that you didn't mention that is a problem to trees here in Wildwood is the deer. And so when the city goes in and they plant these younger trees, and and then the deer come in the winter, and they beat them up. And I went through before this meeting and kind of went and took an inventory of the neighborhood, and I could point out, you know, just a few trees that are street trees that I'll be surprised if they last, because the deer just decimated them. So, you know, the trunks. So I think that there's got to be something we can do to deal with that when they're planting those new trees. If it means that the city has to provide the tubing that goes around the trees or something, because in Wildwood, the deer are a huge problem. So, I mean, for the trees.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. It's always, you know, I live in St. Louis City, so fortunately for me, I don't have to deal with the deer. But it's always frustrating, and it gets, you know, that stuff moves further and further east. You know, I see deer in Forest Park now. So it's definitely something that should be addressed. We are looking for all new street tree plantings, we're making some considerations on that. I'm working with Rick Brown on that. Part of that is we're going to be staking all of the trees now, and staking does provide you with a good foundation for putting some deer protection up. But yeah, I think that's something that does need to be addressed, because it's almost the same issue as planting a tree and not watering it. You're just kind of rolling the dice as to whether or not a deer destroys that tree.
Other questions? Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, I'll jump to the next two topics.
Please jump.
Members of the commission, Mr. Halpin kind of addressed some of the items, I think, not only for tree delineation, tree stand delineation and tree preservation plans, but also landscape plans and street trees. And I just want to highlight a few things regarding both landscape plans and street trees. In terms of the type of trees, the species, both need to be updated substantially, both from the landscape plan perspective and as well as our street trees. Mr. Brown, our Director of Public Works, has been doing that in terms of street trees on an ongoing basis. But again, as Ms. Keefe mentioned, we need to look more toward natives, and we need to get that information out to the public, our residents, so they understand why we picked the tree for this certain location and not necessarily another tree for there. Also, as we move forward, we want to ensure that when we do require landscaping, that landscaping is installed correctly, and that, for the most part, if it is removed after the fact by a disgruntled homeowner or an owner of a commercial center because they believe it blocks the sign, that there is efforts made to ensure that it is replaced with a healthy tree and maintained. And so there is some things regarding our landscaping process that need to be addressed as well. And then finally, I'll conclude, and if Mr. Brown would like to comment, we do need to standardize that tree lawn area where street trees go. Oftentimes in some of the more rigorous terrain in Wildwood, we've narrowed the right-of-way width to accommodate basically clustering the homes closer to the ridge line and avoiding disturbance in the back of the lot, which is typically encumbered by steeper slopes. What that does, though, is it tightens everything from the standpoint of the street, the drive lanes, the curbs, the gutters, and then the tree lawn area and sidewalks. And so in some instances, our effort to preserve or reduce grading and preserve trees has led to our tree lawn areas being less than desirable in width. So we are working on standardizing that, and you'll see that as part of the updated code. So if there's any questions on landscape plans and street trees, Mr. Brown and I will be glad to try to answer them.
Alfred?
One thing I might like to see in all of this is the instruction to not put in all of the same species of tree. For example, you know, in Windcrest in the phase 1, they put almost all pear trees, and then we got the fire blight and they've, had to go in and try to be careful so that we don't lose all of our street trees. We just lost about, on our street, we lost six of the hornbeams this year. Something got of them all. So in our code, if we can put that in, that they don't plant all of the same species to avoid losing an entire area of trees, I think that would be good. Thank you.
And again, I think it's a phrase you've heard from Ms. Keefe and Ms. Halpin, is just diversity and protecting our woodland assets by not necessarily allowing one emerald ash borer to basically kill the whole stock, so to speak. So thank you. Other questions on those two items? If not, Ms. Keefe has the next two.
I have a question. Are the
Yes, ma'am.
developers required to have, is there a standard space, like Mr. Halpin was saying, that it should be 3 feet? And are most of ours 2? Is that something that goes into the developing? Is that a rule that, or can we change that rule to make it more accommodating for the tree space?
Ms. Ward, I think what we've done over the years is we've looked at the topography of the overall site, what a standard street width and right-of-way width might do in terms of additional grading beyond what we would consider appropriate. And so we've varied the tree lawn area in terms of its width. So I guess to answer your question, it varies based upon, at times, site to site. And I think what we're arguing here is knowing that the narrower the tree lawn area is, the less likely we're going to have success. We need to basically standardize it and standardize it at a greater width.
Go ahead, Vicki.
Sorry, one more thing. When you're picking the species for the street trees in the subdivisions, I would request that you also consider trash trucks, because they take out weekly big branches off of these trees, and it's not their fault. They have to get down the street, but they can really do some damage, and so that may be another thing to consider when you're choosing the types of trees for the street trees. So thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Brown's on the Zoom call, so I know he'll take that into account. Thank you. Ms. Keefe.
It appears I am back. And I'm just going to touch on particularly one harmful tree practice that's been brought to our attention from our consultant, Andy Berg, from the Department of Conservation, and that is tree topping. Tree topping is a practice where essentially the tree is topped because of a variety of reasons, power lines, etc. But the problem is this practice damages trees, and it causes, it makes them more susceptible to disease later on. It's unsightly for neighboring properties to have the trees shaved like that. So many cities have been taking action on this practice. The city of St. Peters, for example, they make it unlawful for any person to top a tree on city-owned land or public road right-of-way. And then they also go a bit further to make it unlawful for any person working for hire to top any tree, whether on private or public land within the corporate limits of the city. So they're taking a pretty aggressive road. City of Kirkwood and City of Joplin both prohibit the practice on city maintained property. And I noticed that the City of Charlotte, North Carolina prohibited it on both public and private property. So it's been recommended to us by our consultants that we do something similar here in Wildwood. Any questions?
Will this potentially put us in conflict with any of the utilities that use this method of trimming trees?
I think it's part of our considerations when updating those street tree lists in terms of what trees are most appropriate and in what areas, and then making sure that enough information is communicated so that people understand how high they're going to grow and what's going to be impacted and what trees are best for where. But yes, I think that that's all something that needs to be considered under this. Thank you for your input. Any other comments on this section? Okay, well then that moves us into the next one, which I think I already touched on. Oh, okay, here we go. So I'm just going to go back to this slide maybe, or actually, how about this one? So when talking about tree species and plantings lists and items to include on it, again, we are looking to take that 97-page sustainable plantings guide that currently has a lot of data in a lot of places, but nothing's really summarized and user-friendly to someone who's trying to use it as a reference tool. If you have time to read through it, it is a very nice guide. If you use a keyword search, it is a very nice guide. However, we'd like to move towards something that's a little bit more public friendly and user friendly, such as what I've been pointing out to you in terms of what the city of Manchester has done. In fact, I'm going to stop my share for a moment, and instead I'm going to share their tree packet so I can just flip through it a little bit. But you can see that they have a lot of color. Things are in categories. You can find specific sections. Their tree list is very simplified. It gives you a lot of information, but it's not all over the place. And I think that's where we want to go with this area, is to really simplify those lists and make it easier for you to reference it in a pretty quick fashion.
Is that
Any
document
questions?
located on their website, their city website? Is that where it's found?
Yes. And in fact, to your point, many of the cities that I've studied in the area that particularly care about their trees do have a section of their website that is devoted to it.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair, the next item is forest management and associated sales of timber. And if you're not aware, we actually do allow forest management practices in the city of Wildwood. The several that have occurred over the last 20+ years have always been controversial with the neighbors and even the driving public that go by. What the city does require, though, is that any property owner seeking forest management and sale of timber provide a plan that follows the Missouri Department of Conservation's guidelines for such. And that plan has to be prepared by a professional forester. Therefore, we are at least guaranteed to a certain degree that it is following accepted practices and in principle will help the health of the overall forest once the management practice is complete. However, we need to update the language in our current section relative to forest management. And the things that we've noticed over the course of time is just the restoration techniques of some of the timber management or timber companies is not great. They have to install haul roads to bring the timber out from the areas selected for harvest. And oftentimes those are the last things they seem to want to address. And then finally, given our work of the Watershed Erosion Task Force, we've identified forest management practices in areas of tributaries and creeks as a primary area of need. And so we'll be looking at those areas as well in terms of buffer strips or protection. So as we are not creating problems downstream. So it's something we do allow, and I've been told by many, much smarter than I, that it is good for the health of the forest if done appropriately. And so we are not recommending it be removed, but certainly we need to address a couple of the shortcomings we've seen over the years. If there's any questions on that particular item, I'd be glad to answer them.
Thank you, Mr. Nugent.
Approximately how many forestry operations do we have?
In the course of the last 20 plus years, Ms. Ward, I think we've authorized 5 to 6 of these management efforts by private property owners. So it's not a great number, but oftentimes they are on properties that are 50, 100 to over 200 acres in size. So they can have an impact that is far reaching. Mr. Chair, if there are no other comments, the last item is Ms. Keith.
Robin, you're on mute.
My apologies. Thank you. The last item to discuss this evening is updating our code to include some reference to wildlife and habitat guidelines in our community. Some of them are federal, some of them are state, but there are a lot of different endangered species throughout Wildwood that have habitats that need to be protected as part of tree preservation and restoration code. And one thing we're suggesting is that we reference those protected species and their habitats, and then also take what those guidelines are from other agencies and places, and have reference in our code as to potential restricted times for tree clearing relative to these identified species, and other such references that would kind of bring us in line with what that guidance is. And the whole idea is to protect this habitat for our endangered species, such as our friend here, the bat, who eats all of our Missouri mosquitoes. And I believe Director Vunich has some experience to lend you from his work with the Community Park Project.
Thank you, Ms. Keefe. And yes, members of the commission, in both phases of the community park, we had habitat for the Indiana brown bat, which restricted when we could do tree clearing. It didn't necessarily prohibit the limited number of trees we were to take out, just we could not do it when they were in occupancy, so to speak. Mr. Brown in Public Works has also had to address this on occasion as part of mitigation for some of our roadway projects. So it's something that we know about, but we want others to understand why we're not doing certain things during certain times of the year. So thank you.
Any questions?
Would there also be an opportunity to potentially, identify certain trees or, smaller, more ornamental trees that are, attractors for certain birds, hummingbirds that migrate through here, or butterflies or other species, kind of tie the two together, plantings that would be beneficial to specific species?
I think that could be part of our update to our sustainable plantings guide and public information output.
And Ms. Steppler, we have a specific example. When we did phase 2 of the Manchester Road streetscape, I believe we chose lindens for some of our street trees. And I was told that was an excellent choice for certain types of insects. And so, yes, I think we need to kind of look at that. And as Robin said, incorporate it into either our sustainable plannings guide or at least make it known we're trying to do our best and we ask our residents to do the same. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a great idea. I know when I plant anything in my yard, I take that into consideration, and would be nice to have that resource for everybody in Wildwood.
Thank you for the suggestion, ma'am. Mr. Chair, that is the 14 categories. To the other presenters, I appreciate your clarity and your conciseness and your information. Before we close, are there any other questions or comments or things you want us to investigate that we didn't mention?
Commissioner Helfrey.
I was looking at, when I was reading the documents for this meeting, one of the things that you talked about in one of the documents is tree banking and having a street tree fund. I guess, could you address that a little bit? And do we have it, and how is it used, and does it need to be increased, or do we not have one? So if you could answer those questions, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, I can jump in there because I've done a little bit of research on tree banking since we met with the Missouri Department of Conservation and we talked with them about it. And then I also studied what other cities were doing. And basically, the cities that do use it have basically linked the tree restoration and tree mitigation to a variety of forest maintenance tasks. And so basically they create a mitigation fund. So instead, like in forested places, instead of replacing the tree in a forest, you might instead put money in this fund to meet part of your mitigation requirements. Then this fund can be utilized for things like, those programs that we were talking about, invasive species removal. It could be used for tree plantings. It could be used for anything that would have that link to what we're trying to do with that mitigation. So some cities have certainly done it in the area. I believe there was a question about whether or not it was getting challenged in some cities, whether there was legal challenges experienced, but it's something that we're still investigating. And to my knowledge, we're still looking into it.
And Mr. Chair, with your permission, before we close, I just want to give Mr. Brown an opportunity if he has anything he'd like to add.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, Joe. I don't know that I have anything other than we have been working with Mark and Davey Resource to determine the number of vacant tree sites on our public streets, mainly the local roads, the residential streets and subdivisions. I don't know if Mark, if you know the current number, but we've only gotten about maybe halfway through our overall inventory of street trees, so we don't really know the overall number yet. But it's going to be in the many thousands of vacant sites, I think it's fair to say, where we could plant trees on our roadways within Wildwood. Mark, you know what that number is currently? Are you opening up Creekkeeper to find out?
I don't know what it is. I could look it up real quick if you wanted to, but yeah, I mean, once we get the rest of the inventory completed, it is going to be several thousand. And that is, I think, we've kind of discussed that option with some of the remediation plans for developments, rather than kind of forcing them to cram a certain amount of trees in to satisfy those requirements. You would be better off just taking that as a payment and using it to fund some other activities that are going to be ecologically beneficial.
Yeah, I don't know if this is for Rick or for Mark, but it appears that some of our street trees are possibly too close together. Is that possible? That they should be spaced further apart?
I suppose if there's a specific location, we could certainly look into that.
Like Old Manchester Road, possibly? I don't know. I'm just asking. It just seems like some of them are pretty close together. And maybe we should.
Most of the instances I've seen that look like they were clustered it looks like instances to me where it was probably residents planting trees next to maybe existing trees, that were there when they bought the house, which, in some cases they might be planting that tree just assuming the other one's going to come out soon. Sometimes they just don't know any better and aren't really thinking about the mature size of that tree. But I certainly haven't seen any more of that driving around Wildwood than I have anywhere else. It's hard to prevent people from doing that.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I would add a footnote to that. Obviously, in some of our town center area, in town center areas, some of our public streets, we've not been as successful with our street tree plantings as we had hoped. I can assure the commission we used experts when we came up with the template for it. The diversity of trees, the spacing of the trees, the use of the grates. But we've had some struggles, and certainly as part of this, we're going to investigate that. Mr. Brown spends a lot of time trying to basically address those issues, and we'd like to just solve them once and for all. I think the best example, and I credit this to Mr. Brown, is the phase 3 of the streetscape where we went away from the grates and actually did some planting areas. And those trees seem healthier than any of the others, I think, and will be for a long term. So we are looking at all aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, I've noticed, like in front of the movie theater, there's been some issues with keeping those trees alive.
Yeah, we tend to have more difficulties, I think, sometimes with getting too much moisture at trees than less. And sometimes the tree grates and the sidewalks contribute to that, in my opinion. But we try to rely on Davey and Mark for their expertise in those cases to give us good recommendations. What I have learned in my job is that street trees are very hard. There's a lot to it, so you really have to be attuned to the details to make it work. So
I second that motion, Mr. Brown.
yes.
Any other questions from the commission members?
Is there a motion to, I guess, adjourn?
Well, Mr. Chair, just a big thank you
Yeah.
to all the commission members for fitting an extra meeting in their busy schedules, and to Mark and Robin, Travis, and others. Thank you for being here as well. We really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you all for all your information.
Yeah,
Good night.
absolutely. Thank you for all your work.
Yes.
Good night.
Thank you for having us.
Night.
Do we need a voice vote to adjourn or a motion?
Adjourn.
Mr. Ward?
I move
Yes,
to adjourn.
and seconded. All right, voice vote, all in favor?
Bye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstains? Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.